This is the new Mayfair Lookout 1844 for 1854 box set. Now, today or tomorrow or whenever, I'm going to be playing 1854. A kind viewer, very kind, sent me a copy of this. It's something I was on the lookout for and definitely would be picking up. But I wasn't quite sure about how you obtained it. And before I got a chance to do so, he offered to send me a copy of it, which was really wonderful because I don't know, it warms my heart so much when I get games from people. I don't know why. It's just really a nice way of showing some appreciation. Of course, at this point I have so many games, but this is one I was going to buy no matter what. It turns out it's a really, really lovely set of components. You've got two different games here. The 1844, which is Switzerland, and I haven't unpacked that or played that at all yet. And 1854, which I've had a couple of chances to play with. The first, well, I found out I was playing it this weekend, actually, and a long time in advance, but I was very excited about that idea and ended up breaking it out a couple of days ahead of time and fiddling around with it in 4 players and went through a few operating rounds. And then we actually got to play, and I was kind of impressed. It played closer to 1830 than I thought it would from the starting situation. There's a lot of weird stuff going on in it, but at least up until a certain point in the game, the flow of the game has a very 1830 feel, and maybe we'll see that again. Maybe in part because we were playing 6 players. I only played 4 players when I was just fiddling with the pieces because it's easier to get an idea that way. It's got a fairly small bank, $10,000. I'm not going to go over all of the rules of 1854. In particular, I'm not going to go over the 18XX core rules. If you look at my 1830 video, that goes over the core for most of the 18XX designs. And trying to think if I did that in 18AL as well, but 1830 is probably the best one to look at for my videos in terms of getting the heart of the rules explanation down. I will explain though where things are weird here, and there's a lot that's different, and by weird I mean doesn't follow that 1830 pattern. I tend not to play I tend to almost never play things of the 1829 family. Part because I don't own them. They go for so much that, and I don't like them as much. Okay. The rule book to 54 is a little shaky in places, and people have added house rules, and we'll think about that. 44 looked a little bit more solid. First of all, what do you have? You have some nice cash money in the game. I know a lot of you like to play with chips better. Man, I don't like the stacks of chips. They just weird me out. There's too much height to the table. This is bad enough in terms of just having big piles of chips on the table. Maybe if they were very thin chips, like potato chips, they would work well. You have a bunch of track, most of which looks very much like your 1830 classic track. The little equal signs here is just to indicate it's for Austria. That's the Austrian flag there. The Swiss ones have the plus sign. They were mathematical countries. When we go over here, things get a little different. You can see we have, this is going to be Vienna's special token. I think it's the only really special token in this game. The greens, again, it's all the kind of common 1830 track, and it's used in most of the games, but unlike some of the games that I've played recently, it doesn't have a lot of weird track in it. It has some odd cities. In particular, we have these kind of crowfoot cities, but they're all 2-dot cities at the green level. Then the brown level, instead of coming out 6 ways, they all have a blank space, and that's maintained in the gray level. That means that you're able to upgrade pretty much any city on the board, I believe. There might be some that cannot be, because one thing in the game is, no, it looks like all of them, the double doink spaces do upgrade into cities eventually, or can. But we've got these gray cities, and I guess that's about it for those. You'll notice the shares have high percentages on them. That changes as the game goes on, and we'll take a look at that. You've got trains. I haven't really spread them all out, but they look very much like the 1830 trains. So the 2 train costs $100, which is a little more expensive. The 3 trains $200, again a little higher price. $320 for the 4 train. Same numbers here and similar progression. The 5 trains $530. Hey, they're getting cheaper. This right? No, that's still more expensive. 6 trains $670 instead of $630. And then we have an 8 train, which is $900. And finally, you have the Orient Express train, which is sort of a skip train. It's able to hit just the cities at once too on its route. In addition, you have these plus trains, which are a special situation for this little tiny board. And we'll explain that in detail. That's one of the weirdnesses in this one. You also have mail contracts, $100 and $200 mail contract. I haven't seen those before. I think they show up in other games, but I'm not sure. Which are a way to get cash into your corporations. Now, what's kind of weird about this one is it's hard to get cash into your corporation in terms of by operating. You have no route into your corporate treasury if you have shares either in the initial offering or in the bank pool. There's nothing like that, but there is a possibility, well, there's a fair likelihood that most of the companies are going to be getting an influx of cash. And the companies are going to be fully capitalized, which means when you float them, they start with 10 times their share value in the corporate treasury. These are not the corporations. We'll get to these in a moment. We have 5 of these. They're called mountain railways. They're basically your privates in the game. But then we have 6 minor railways, which look a little bit like 1835 miners, right? Yeah, we did 35. The special thing about these is these are called local railways. They play on this little map here and nowhere else. Now that little map represents these 2 hexes here, which is kind of weird because you can build these hexes during the play of the game, but you can't, these companies come busting out of here into those hexes, and will end up starting as 3 not quite full corporations, but bigger than these miners are. Another thing that's kind of funky with this is you have these tunnels, and they're probably both 44 and 54 have tunnels in play. They can kind of disrupt the game, and that's where some of the house rules come in, because you can use the tunnels to screw up the track lays that people can make. Another thing you have, these are for the minor companies here, but you have these, and those are going to be for stock options, and that's another special rule in this game. Otherwise, you have pretty standard stuff, your off-map locations color-coded so that you know where to find them. Oh, hey, look, the stock valuation chart is all in hexes. That's kind of weird. There are a few little misprint type things in the game. For example, this little space here looks like it has a mountain. Now, I can't find anyone who's talking about it, and then there's also places where there's a little bit of river there or something like that. But this space really looks like it should be mountain, but there's no mountain cost. Otherwise, the spaces have the price that it would cost to build the first rail on that space. You have a couple really off-board spaces, which is Paris and Constantinople, and those can only be reached with that Super Orient Express train. And you can see those are high value cities. When we compare the cities, and this is kind of an important thing, well, we're looking at 50 here, 60 down here, 60 over here. There's some good valued cities here. And of course, in addition to this, if you have the OE train, you can bust out to Constantinople where there's a 70 or Paris where there's a 90. Over here, our final run goes up to a 70. So we've got a pretty good run over at Vienna. Another weirdness, this little negative here, you have to pay $10 to use that piece of track off your run. So your run gets decreased if you use that. It's sort of a tariff fees, whatever. All right. Well, that's enough on the components. I guess there are a couple of play aids in play. There's this train chart, which tells you supposedly how many trains there are, but it lies. There are only 3-5 trains, for example. It also gives you the phases, and both in German and English. There's a full set of rules in German as well. And you have a tile upgrade chart, which is pretty easy and pretty simple. There is one little funkiness to it, which is that the double Doinker cities upgrade to be a green city, and then eventually they can upgrade all the way. There's a very limited number of these gray cities. There's only 2 of them, so they are a really valuable commodity. And they come out when the phase 7, which is when the 8 trains are available. Money-wise, starting player, I don't know. Does this work out? 24, 2,700, 24. Yeah, so the money is not a simple division of a certain amount of money like it is in many of the games. It's actually kind of tinkered with a little bit. So you end up in smaller number of players with what looks like more money. 200 or 330. I'm not doing math very well here. Okay, so we'll leave that out. This is your starting packet that you'll have an opening auction for. And I'm going to have to switch batteries because I just got done with something else and I'm so glad to be done with it, at least for now. And I'm able to start this. You have another thing in the components that I wanted to point out. You have some par values that are kept off here. For the stock value chart, the orange spaces, or brown, the certificates aren't going to count towards your certificate limit. Here are your par value spaces here. Got some arrows to tell you which way to go when you're forced in certain directions. We have the certificate limits here, and this is a sort of a complex track, which is going to be based on the number of corporations that have split shares. As you notice, we got 40% on top. Underneath them, there's 20% shares from those companies. When the company splits its share, a bunch of 10% shares come out and the presidency drops down to a 20% share. And those extra shares become available to be purchased from at the current value from the corporation. So the money goes into the corporate pool. So you fully capitalize to begin with, and then when you split, you got 5 more shares at potentially a high value. Now when they split is when the company's stock value crosses this line. When it does that, you end up performing that split. And the players' stocks have just been devalued significantly. They have half as much value because instead of 40% of the company, i.e. 4 times the value of that share, and whatever runs they make, they only have 20% now. Or instead of 20%, they only have 10%. And to make up for that, well, that extra money comes out of the bank and it just pays out the share price for sort of the lost percentage that you have. So you kind of get to sell them without getting hurt by that. There's some other weird things going on here. You'll notice the hexagon allows us some complex, let's do it not in German, some complex operations on here. So when a so if a company doesn't pay dividends, it goes left. If it pays dividends, it goes right. When you sell a share, it goes down left. When you are all sold out at the end of a stock round, then it goes upright. But here are the weird ones. If a company sells a train to another company, it goes down right. Okay? So the price goes down, but it's making some movement in this direction, which, depending on where it happens, can actually, in the long run, help out its stock value, depending on what happens again, if the price is going up from this. If the company buys a train from another company, the value goes up, but it's kind of falling back in that direction, which short term it's getting a stock value increase, but long term it may not be doing as well. Now, there's this end of game space here. The rules do not specify that is one of the ways the game can end. And I'm not sure whether or not to play with that. Again, there's some things that are a little funky in terms of how the rules are actually presented and whether they align properly with the game. You get the feeling this wasn't terribly well play tested. And this existed before the recent edition, which they did a wonderful job on the components, but maybe not such a wonderful job in terms of nailing down the rules and making sure that they actually work as well enough to suit these components. It's an interesting game, though. Let's dive into the rules in earnest. So, like I said, you have multiple different types of railways. You have the mountain railways, which are your private companies, and let's take a look at what their effects are. So, first of all, they all have a location, well, they have a price, and they have an income per turn, which pays out at the beginning of the operating rounds. But they also have a little space that they have a choo-choo on. So this one's the Ausschifferbahn, and we look for that, and it's not that one. Maybe it is. I don't think so, though. We keep looking. There it is. Okay. The special ability of that, you're not going to be able to ever sell these to your corporations. They're always held in a player's hands. And I believe they can't ever be traded between players. In many games, you're allowed to sell a private at an agreed upon price. I don't believe you're allowed to at all in this. Anyway, the little rail symbol indicates that if you own a corporation and you own the private that controls a hex, you don't have to pay the terrain cost for that hex in order to lay the first track there. And that's a pretty neat little advantage. This doesn't do anything to close the corporation, the private company. Now, these also have a little symbol on them which says, hey, once per game, you can take 20 bucks off a mountain space. And when you exercise that, you flip it over. Again, it doesn't close the private, but it's a once per game activity. Likewise, this will allow you to build a tunnel for 40 bucks less. Tunnels cost you 100 bucks to build. Here you can get one for 60, and when you're blasting through a space like this, that's definitely a reduction in price. This one allows all your corporations to run through grots as if it's 10 bucks more than whatever it is, which is a pretty cool advantage. Now, all these privates close, just like the 1830 privates, when the first 5 train comes out. So it's not something you can plan on for a long-term capability. Let's skip over the miners for a bit because they're pretty complicated. These guys, each come with a 20% share of one of the corporations. This one comes with a 20% share of the VB back here, which is a neat little place where it can run a few trains in a tight little pattern and make decent money early in the game, and maybe be able to run pretty heavily later. It has not that many tokens, only 3 tokens. So it's not one of the monster companies. The companies either have 3 or 4 tokens in this. The SD is over here, and it's a pretty good company. It's right in Vienna, which is high value. It's got a route south-east to get to Constantinople way, if you get that huge train. But it also has the route south to Graz, which if you have that miner is a benefit. It's maybe not, these guys are kind of set up nicely to start carving out in this direction for the east-west route. It's not really as well positioned for that, but it's not badly positioned. Once you blast through this little 50-buck mountain, you're in as good a position if that's what you want to do. So you have a lot of options with this company right off the bat early. Unfortunately, if you look at the prices, this sucker's 170 bucks for the 2 shares, and it pays out 20 per round. Now these guys close as soon as their corporation that they're associated with operates. And by operates, I mean runs its first train. What that means is it's pretty likely, especially in a 6-player game, that you're only going to get 2 payouts from your private. Which means this is, for example, 40 bucks off, 130. Well, that's not bad. Even if they started at 67, you're making $4 or whatever, right? It's not great. It's not something you really want to bid for. Now this one, on the other hand, is more questionable. You get 50 bucks over those 2 rounds. It's worth 140 bucks. That means if they start at 67, you actually lose money on it. Still probably worth buying at face value, but not terribly great. Now these guys are the little miners. They're going to run over on this map, and they get to start at one of these cities, and they have their own little dots. And they run kind of like 1835 miners, which is to say you run them as a corporation, like they're a full corporation. They buy trains, they do all that kind of stuff. They may have different rules. In these cases, they have different train limits, and it's even crazier because they can only use they use a different set of trains than the rest of the game does. And in fact, so do what they grow up into, which is these local major companies or something like that. Yeah. And they grow into those through a merger. It's not like the Prussian. It's more like they merged to become kind of small little railways, and they're all centered in this area. And they use obsolete trains. Anyway, the weird little plus trains, the way they're going to work is that you can hit one city, a big circle, and as many boinkers as you can hit without having to go through another city. And you have a dot. Now, the 2 plus hits 2 cities and as many boinkers, and there's a 3 plus as well. That's getting kind of out of the range of these guys. These guys split their income. When they make a run, 50% of the income goes into the company treasury, 50% goes into the player's treasury. It's just like 1835 on that. They may not own mail contracts, even though they have a space for one. Okay, now there's one special thing about both the corporations and the miners here, which is, so the miners have a train limit of 2, but they're not obligated to own a train, and they're allowed to own trains that they can't run. They can only run the 1 plus, 2 plus, and 3 plus trains. But you can park, say, an XS2 train on them to get the cash over into one of your corporations. Of course, remember, stock values are going to play around a little bit when a corporation buys or sells a train. The major local railways is what these turn into. Starting in round 5, when the first 5 train comes out, at the beginning or end of any operating round, you can agree to merge. And you find a buddy and you agree that you should merge with them. And what happens then is you stop being here. These corporations disappear. Their track stays, but the tokens don't. And then you come out and you can place on one of these two spaces, you can place a dot on the green city that's there. Now, when the first 6 train comes up, everybody has to merge, and there's auto merges. The 1 merges with the 2. Well, the lowest number 1 merges with the next lowest number 1, etc. out of the unpaired set. If people can agree, some of them might be knocked out. So like the 1 could merge with the 5, well then the 2 and the 3 merge. That doesn't mean anything over here. They grow up and go on the main board. They combine their cash, all the 1+, 2+, 3+ trains disappear, and now they're allowed to use the trains that have rusted. And they're allowed to use the 2 trains at first, and then, let's see, trying to remember where that's explained. Okay, we'll leave that alone. Those old trains they're able to buy, but they have to pay a $30 surplus for the price of those trains, which is still a steal to be able to run trains at that kind of cost. The shares for these corporations are going to be 2 50% shares. The 2 people who merge each get 1. They move around on the stock value chart now. The shares can be sold. There's no limit to what percent of a company can be in the bank pool. But the president's certificate can never go in the bank pool. There's a game where it can that I played recently. Was that 41? I don't know. Okay, these guys can buy any of the rusted trains that are in offer. Now this is important because when the 8 train comes out and a 4 train is bought again, the 2 train rusts permanently and is not available even for these corporations. It's just too old. Okay. Share splits. We've already kind of talked about these. When you push over here, the shares are flipped over and you get cash for any shares that you haven't, that you no longer own, that you lost. In the case that you have a share on option, you don't get any cash for the share that you have an option on. So let me briefly explain how an option works. An option, you buy a 20% or you take a 20% share, you pay for only 10% of it. You put this marker on the 20% share that's in your holding, and you put this marker on the location of the price that you paid. You could put it over here if you paid par, and that means that you're obligated, or you have the option, there's an option after all, to buy the next 10% of that share for the price that you settled, that you committed to before. If you don't buy that, you can do nothing else in your stock round in terms of purchases until you either buy that option by exercising, or you sell the 10% that you're holding that's committing you to that option. I had to look up the history of stock options because I was curious. There's other games, I think 1817 even has them. I'm not sure. I haven't played that and I really want to. But in 1854, I was curious whether or not stock options existed as a real factor. I knew that There were options on commodities previous to that, but it turns out in the 18th century, stock options had already been invented. And by the 19th century, obviously, they were pretty well established, actually. All right, we got to swap batteries again. That kind of question always comes to my mind when I'm playing an 18xx game, because I know that there's certain abstractions that don't really reflect much very well. For example, the way some of the stocks pay out, etc., into the company treasury usually doesn't make a lot of sense. And you can make arguments for one way or another, but none of them really nail it down in a way that I believe is accurate. And there's other factors that seem a little inaccurate. For example, you can't vote a president out, even if you have a majority of shares in other players' hands who might vote for another president or something like that. Okay, for the initial auction round, this is really an 1830 style auction. You can buy this certificate, the first private that's open. You can put a bid on any of the others. Once you just keep going around, you can keep throwing bids out. You have to commit your cash to your bids. It isn't usable. You can't use it on multiple bids. But unlike the 1830 auction round, you're allowed to withdraw a bid in order to put it somewhere else, as long as you're not the leader on that bid. And this is kind of nice, because quite often you get overbid on something, you don't want it anymore, but your money's tied up in the auction in some of the games, and that's not the case here. You have the option to pull it out if you're not the leading bidder on that item. The minimum bids are $5 more than the current price. They don't have to be multiples of 5, so you got some trickery you can do with that if you really need to. It's conceivable that the whole packet doesn't sell. If that happens, you run a little operating round with whatever sold. It's also conceivable this sucker doesn't sell, in which case that everybody passes and it just sits out there, in which case it's offered to the first player at $5 less, or to the person who has, it would be the first player. And if they don't want it, this is the 1830 system for this, and I'm not going to look it up, but basically it keeps decreasing, and eventually somebody gets stuck with it at 0. Everybody, the first player, everybody gets offered it at a more and more reduced price. Now it is worth the $20. So I don't think you'll see that. I don't think you'll see a game so cash poor, or players with so much concept in mind of what they need to use their money with, although maybe not in 6 you'll see it, that they just can't afford to buy this unless it's 0. And you certainly wouldn't mind it at 0. It makes money. It might pass priority, but you don't care that much about it. During your stock round, normal stuff, you can sell 1 share, you can buy, or you can sell any shares, you can buy 1 certificate or share. You're not allowed to sell in the first share round because, well, that's when everybody's floating companies and such. All right, the director's share at the beginning, when a company is first starting, you got to buy a 40% share. That's a big chunk of cash, but it means that you're not going to have the company stolen anywhere near as easily, even though people can buy 20% shares. There just aren't that many shares. You can hold 100% of a corporation until it passes this line, at which point you're at the 60% that you probably are used to for most of the other games. Like I said, the bank pool can hold as much as it likes. Now, your certificate limit is quite low, especially in 6 players. It's only 5 certificates at the beginning of the game, until companies start passing over here. A certificate counts as one of these cards. Directors, is 40% on 1 certificate. That's pretty cool. One of these. Okay. It leads you to an interesting question, which is whether or not you want to push across the line, because If other companies do, you get a higher certificate limit and you can hold more of your corporation. You can probably make as much cash off of your stock portfolio as a whole if you don't cross the line. And at the same time, you can pull money in by swallowing into your corporate treasuries. On the other hand, you're not making any share value. However you want to look at that. Okay. I've already kind of explained stock options. What happens is you can only do this with 20% certificates. When you buy the 40%, you pay 4 times the price. When you buy a 20%, you pay twice the current price. Well, the par value if it's from the initial offering. Current price from the bank pool. Current price from the splits. And that goes into the company treasury. Well, the 20% shares, when you buy them, and it doesn't matter whether it's initial offering or bank pool, you might not have enough money to buy 2 shares of the company. Well, you can buy 1 share and put an option down on the other. And I explained the mechanism for that. You put this marker on the 20%, pretend this is a 20%. You take it into your portfolio and you put this down on the current price that you paid. Now you're locked in. That other 10% you can buy at that price. Or you can sell the certificate that you, the 10% share that you still have at whatever price the company actually is at. So it allows you to actually, lock in a share for less money. But it puts you in a position where you're not allowed to buy another share. You can't sell the option in the same stock round in which it's bought. You have to wait until the next stock round. And we talked about how... So this 10% share can be very important because it takes 50% of a company to float it. And you may not have enough money for 60% or a desire to make the price so low that 60% is where you want to go. So it's a dangerous choice though, but not a terribly dangerous choice. It's no worse than holding that extra 10%. At first I thought there were other problems with it. Your operating rounds work kind of like an 1830. Oh, well, very much like an 1830. When the 2 trains are out, you're at yellow. There's only 1 operating round between stock rounds. When the 3 trains come out, you go to green. There's 2 operating rounds between. When the 5 trains come out, you go to brown. And the train progressions are the same, basically, except for the 8s. Okay, when you make your operating round, first thing that happens is if you have a mail contract, it pays out. Now, the mail contracts are kind of weird. First of all, there's 2 different varieties, $100 and $200. And your corporation pays this at the end of its turn, a little after buying trains. At the beginning of the turn, they just get an amount of money that's fixed based on the type of mail route that they've taken, if they took one. You can only take 1 in the course of a game, and it stays with you forever. So in the yellow phase 2 or whatever, when the 2 trains are out, you only get $10 for this one. You get $30 for this one. They're not symmetrical. The $200 one goes down in proportion to where this guy's actually worth more percentage-wise at the late stage of the game. However, this guy still is worth more full value-wise, and if you buy him early, you can get quite a bit of money off of him. It becomes less reasonable to buy the $200 one as you go late in the game, though, because the return on your investment, the percentage you're getting on that $100 for each operating round, is less. You're allowed to build track as normal, one tile lay per turn. You can place a station marker again as normal. Station markers cost $40 for the first one, $100 for each additional. Very 1830. Nothing weird about the distance here. Then you're allowed to run your trains again, pretty much standard rules. Now, here's where one place where it gets kind of fuzzy in the game is there's multiple cities or city dots in Vienna, and it's not clear from the rules whether those are multiple cities, which they are in 1844 on the other side of this board, or if they're all considered one city. The implication in the rules is Vienna is a single city, and so that you wouldn't be able to run from Vienna to Vienna the way you can run from New York to New York in 1830, or many other games have that kind of being able to run between two dots on the same tile. Yeah, the cost for building. Okay. So, in addition, and you have your upgrades, they have standard rules for how you can upgrade the tiles. Like I said, there's some tricks to this. And there's one special space. St. Potent on the local map can be upgraded with the number 15 tile, which is a green special case. And we got to swap batteries again. Okay, remember how I talked about tunnels? Crap over here. You can build a tunnel. There's a number of reasons you'd want to do so. Obviously, one of them is, hey, I can get through a little cheaper. Another one is, I don't want to hit doinkers. You can lay a tunnel over a hex, and now you don't hit the little towns in there. You can't build a tunnel where there's a major city, one of the circles. However, you can build a town where a major city might show up and avoid the doinkers and the major city. And you cause all kind of problems when this happens. Tiles that contain a tunnel may be upgraded if the tunnel exits are not involved. The tunnel stays in place. This is where problems start happening. And the worst of the problems seems to center on this hex right here. Although it can also be used to really shaft these hexes. And the question is, do you need some special rules? I'm going to play without any. When I played recently, we played with a rule, you can't build a tunnel here unless it connects to the FJ's starting location. Otherwise, what could happen is somebody could set up to go up into here and cut that off. You know what? If you want to starve a company out in that sort of, and you might be able to build tunnels so that they can never come out. If you want to starve a company out with that kind of effort, fine. There's one less company in the game because nobody's going to buy it, right? It might be possible to wait until somebody starts the company and be able to trash it at that moment. I think this company is going to start early enough in the game that nobody's going to be able to do that very easily. We'll just leave it alone. There are a lot of pitfalls in an 18xx game. Well, here's one of them for this one, and I'm perfectly willing to live it. There can be multiple tunnels in the same hex, but they can't cross, and obviously the limit there is 2, and you basically have to do, I think, because there's no sharp turn tunnels, something like that. Stations, pretty standard rules there. Train runs, pretty standard rules there. The only exception are the ones that I've pointed out. The Orient Express being able to skip, the plus trains being able to hit as many doinkers as they like, etc. You calculate out your revenue, and then you're either able to pay it out, in which case everybody gets a percentage of that revenue as per the percentage of the company they hold. The stock value goes forward. Withhold, in which case the stock value falls back, and the money all goes in the company treasury. Then you must purchase trains. You may purchase trains if you have a free space for one. You must purchase a train if your corporation doesn't have a train. The only exception there is minor companies aren't corporations. They don't have to buy a train, which has the implication that they cannot buy a train if they don't have the cash for it. You can agree to sell a train between companies, but I think this might be the game, maybe it's 44, which has a restriction where you can't sell. I don't know. I'll leave this alone. Yeah, I don't think there's a limitation here. You can't dump trains voluntarily. Any company can own any kind of train in order to sell it. But major companies and local bonds must own a train it can run for revenue. The local bonds can only buy trains scrapped by other companies, and this can't be plus trains, so they can't trade with other companies. If you have to sell things off, there's a restriction here, is there not? You must sell shares. You cannot change the directorship of any companies when you're dumping shares. This is an interesting little twist. First of all, it makes it more likely that you could go bankrupt and win the game. But it also prevents you from having two companies that are going to fall and allowing you an out of the stock round dump of a company. I kind of don't know how I feel about that. That's such a cool thing to set up, but I can see where some people don't want that happening. We talked about the phase changes, I think. Scrapping is pretty standard. The game ends when the bank is out of money. That is the only ending listed here. Elsewhere in the rules, it says that the game ends when a player goes bankrupt, i.e. cannot buy a train because they can't sell enough to buy the cheapest train available. And then there's this hint here, which may or may not apply. And then you count your money, as you would in any 18xx game. And them's the rules, as far as I know. Let's send it up.